The year is 1506. On a dusty road in Spain, a bizarre funeral procession is on the move, but there's a catch: they only travel at night. It's led by the queen herself, Joanna of Castile. And in the coffin is her dear husband, who, by the way, is starting to decompose. A cross-country tour with a corpse, no tickets, no souvenir t-shirts. But behind this macabre spectacle is a much darker truth. This isn't just a grieving widow. This is a cornered queen fighting for her throne, for her children, and for her very sanity. History, with its usual subtlety, would give her a name: Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. Was she truly insane, a classic case of a heart broken by grief? Or was her madness actually a carefully constructed cage built by the most powerful men in Europe? Her husband, her father, and her son, who all needed her out of the way so they could rule. It turns out the quickest way to neutralize a powerful woman is to label her emotionally unstable, a classic tactic that depressingly still works today. This is a cursed chamber, a place where we peel back the gold plating of history to find the cracks underneath. To understand how a queen could be erased from her own story, you first have to understand the world that wrote it. This isn't just any time or place. This is late 15th century Spain, a kingdom at a violent, glorious, and deeply schizophrenic crossroads. On one hand, this was the dawn of a golden age. Her parents, Ferdinand and Isabella, had just wrapped up the Reconquista, uniting Spain under a single Christian banner for the first time in centuries. They were the power couple of Europe, the Brangelina of the 1490s, only with more crusading and substantially fewer adoptions. They were funding explorers like Christopher Columbus to sail off the edge of the map, who in turn were bringing back news of a so-called New World, along with gold potatoes and a host of future geopolitical headaches. It was an era of unprecedented expansion, ambition, and wealth. Spain was on the verge of becoming the world's first global superpower. But for every glimmer of golden light, there was a long, dark shadow. This was also the era of the Spanish Inquisition. While some ships sailed west seeking gold, others were busy lighting pyres in town squares. It was a world of fervent militant faith, where religious purity was paramount and deviation was met with suspicion, torture, and fire. This potent cocktail of boundless ambition and rigid dogma created a very specific kind of political climate, one that was ruthless, paranoid, and obsessed with legitimacy, bloodlines, and control. In this world, you were either a predator or prey, and the line between the two was terrifyingly thin. And at the heart of this gilded, volatile machine was the royal family, whose primary business was survival and succession. This brings us to the rules of the game. To a modern mind, royal succession seems simple. You just wait in line. But in the 15th century, it was less like a queue and more like a brutal, multi-generational, family-run mafia where your closest relatives were also your most dangerous business rivals. The single most important commodity in this world was a legitimate heir. Everything else was secondary. This made royal women, particularly princesses, a unique and precarious asset. A princess wasn't really a person. She was a strategic instrument. Think of her less as a daughter and more as a high-value walking, talking portfolio of assets. She was a diplomatic bargaining chip, a peace treaty sealed with a vow, and most importantly, a vessel for the next generation of rulers. Her value wasn't in her intelligence, her wit, or her personality. It was in the strength of her claim and the viability of her womb. She was a blue-chip stock that could walk, and her marriage wasn't a romance. It was a merger and acquisition. Love, that was a delightful but entirely optional bonus feature, and one that was rarely included in the final package. For a woman to wield direct power, to actually rule in her own name, was a dangerous anomaly. It could happen, as it did with Juana's own mother Isabella, but it required a will of iron and a political landscape that bent, however reluctantly, to her favor. For Juana, that landscape was about to break. Into this world, our key players are born. First, there is our protagonist, Juana of Castile. As a young princess, she wasn't seen as mad at all. She was exceptionally bright, fluent in multiple languages, musically gifted, and deeply intelligent. But she was also cursed with something dangerous for a woman of her time, a passionate heart. She felt everything with a fierce intensity: her love, her faith, her sorrow, her rage. In another life, she might have been a brilliant artist or a poet, but as the heir to a great kingdom, that emotional depth wasn't seen as a gift. It was a liability, a fire that in the eyes of the men around her needed to be contained before it burned the whole house down. She was a woman of profound feeling in a world that demanded female submission. Then comes the catalyst for her downfall, Philip, Duke of Burgundy, soon to be known to history as Philip the Handsome. And to be fair to the history books, the man was gorgeous. Think of him as a 15th century rock star, complete with the charm, the swagger, and the legion of adoring fans. Unfortunately, he also had a rock star's sense of fidelity, which is to say, none whatsoever. He possessed the loyalty of a stray cat in mating season. Philip was charming, ambitious, and politically astute. He looked at Juana, the intelligent, passionate woman who was his wife, and saw only one thing: a golden ticket. She was his path to the throne of Castile, the richest prize in all of Europe, and he was willing to play any part, the loving husband, the concerned spouse, to get it. Of course, Philip had a rival for the role of Juana's chief manipulator, her own father, Ferdinand of Aragon. If Philip was a rock star, Ferdinand was the shrewd, calculating studio executive who owned the label. He was one of the most cunning politicians of his generation, a master of the long game. Think of him as a CEO who was perfectly willing to declare his own daughter mentally incompetent if it meant he could orchestrate a hostile takeover of the family business. Did he love Juana? On some level, perhaps, but his love for power and his deeply held belief that only he was capable of steering the ship of state would always come first. He would weaponize his daughter's grief and her passion against her with the cold, detached precision of a surgeon. We must also speak of her mother, the formidable Queen Isabella of Castile. Isabella was no one's fool. She was a brilliant, effective ruler who had fought tooth and nail for her own crown. She understood the brutal game of power better than anyone. She loved her daughter, but she was also a pragmatist who knew that the stability of her newly unified kingdom was paramount. It was her decision to marry Juana to Philip to secure a political alliance against France. It was a sound strategic move, but in doing so, she unwittingly delivered her passionate, vulnerable daughter into the hands of a man who would become her tormentor. In her own will, Isabella tried to protect Juana's rights as queen, a sign that even she feared what the men in Juana's life might do once she was gone. And finally, waiting in the wings is the ultimate beneficiary of this tragedy, Juana's own son, Charles. He would grow up to become the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, ruler of an empire upon which the sun never set. He would see his mother only a handful of times in his life, and he would be the one to sign the orders that kept her locked away for the final decades of her life. He loved his mother, one imagines, in the same way one loves a vast and valuable trust fund that you cannot yet access. Her imprisonment was the necessary, if unfortunate, price for his own undisputed power. These were the people surrounding Juana: a charming, cheating husband, a cold, calculating father, and an ambitious son. Each of them in their own way held a key to her cage. The stage was set not for a glorious reign, but for one of the most profound and personal betrayals in royal history. The story of Juana's descent, or rather, her push into the abyss, begins not with a crown, but with a marriage. When she was sent to Flanders to marry Philip the Handsome, it was meant to be a straightforward political transaction. But when they met, something unexpected happened: chemistry. A powerful, volatile, all-consuming attraction. It wasn't a slow burn, it was a chemical fire. They were so taken with each other that they demanded to be married immediately that very day, bypassing all the carefully planned royal pomp and circumstance. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed like a fairy tale. A political merger had accidentally become a passionate love affair. But fairy tales, especially royal ones, have a nasty habit of turning sour. The passionate husband quickly revealed his true nature. Philip, it turned out, was an equal opportunity admirer of the female form, and he saw no reason why marriage should interfere with his extracurricular activities. His infidelities were constant, brazen, and deeply humiliating for his proud, intelligent wife. Juana, who loved with the same fierce intensity that she did everything else, did not take this well. She wasn't one to suffer in dignified silence. She confronted him. She raged. She wept. In one legendary incident, she found one of Philip's favorite mistresses, grabbed a pair of scissors, and proceeded to give the woman a very aggressive, very unsolicited haircut. Now, in a normal relationship, this would be a sign of a serious crisis. In the royal court of the 15th century, it was a PR disaster for Juana. The narrative wasn't about Philip's infidelity. It was about Juana's hysterical reaction. Every outburst, every public argument, every tearful confrontation was noted, whispered about, and carefully catalogued by Philip's allies. These were not seen as the desperate acts of a heartbroken and publicly shamed woman. They were filed away as Exhibit A in the growing case for her instability. The gaslighting had begun. She wasn't just angry, she was unbalanced. She wasn't just hurt, she was melancholy. She wasn't just a wife demanding fidelity. She was a woman losing her mind. The situation escalated dramatically in 1504. A message arrived from Spain. Queen Isabella, Juana's formidable mother, was dead. Suddenly, Juana was no longer just the Duchess of Burgundy. She was Juana, Queen of Castile, the ruler of one of the most powerful kingdoms in the world. This should have been her moment of triumph. Instead, it was the beginning of the end. The scent of power was in the air, and the sharks began to circle. Her husband Philip saw his chance to go from consort to king. Her father Ferdinand, who had been ruling Aragon, now saw an opportunity to seize control of Castile, as well effectively reuniting all of Spain under his sole command. The two men who had been rivals now formed an unholy alliance with a single shared goal: to sideline Juana. Instead of comforting their grieving wife and daughter, they saw a job opening. They began a ruthless political campaign, spreading rumors of her incapacitating grief and mental fragility to the courts of Europe. They met in secret, signing treaties that declared Juana unfit to rule and appointing themselves as co-regents. It was the ultimate betrayal. They were forcing her to watch as her own husband and her own father carved up her inheritance right in front of her, all while patting her on the head and telling the world she was too unwell to understand what was happening. At one point, Philip effectively held her prisoner in Flanders, preventing her from traveling to Castile to claim her own crown. She was a queen with a kingdom, but she couldn't reach it. Then, in 1506, the chessboard was violently upended again. After finally making it to Spain with Juana, Philip, the picture of health and vitality, suddenly fell ill with a fever and died within days. He was just 28 years old. For Juana, who despite all the betrayals, still felt a deep obsessive love for her husband, the loss was catastrophic. Her world, already tilted on its axis, now shattered completely. And this is where the story turns from political thriller to surreal Gothic tragedy. This is where the endless funeral procession begins. Juana refused to let Philip's body be buried. Overcome with a grief that bordered on madness, or perhaps something else entirely, she ordered his coffin to be prepared for a journey. The official story is that she was so deranged she couldn't part with him. But look closer, and you see the cold, desperate logic of a queen who had been checkmated at every turn. This was her last move in a game she was destined to lose. By law, her authority as queen was absolute. Her father Ferdinand was circling ready to pounce and declare himself regent. But how could he when the queen was still in mourning, dutifully escorting the body of her consort across the land? The macabre procession became her royal court, her moving capital. The coffin was her shield. As long as she possessed her husband's body, she possessed a tangible symbol of her status. It was a horrifying, heartbreaking, and frankly brilliant political gambit. It was her way of shouting to the world, "I am still the queen. The game is not over until I say it is." So began the world's most depressing road trip. For 8 agonizing months, the procession snaked its way across the Spanish countryside, only traveling at night to, as Juana insisted, honor a husband who now lived in darkness. She forbid any women from approaching the coffin, her pathological jealousy outliving the man himself. Her dead husband, in a twisted way, was now the only reliable travel companion she had. He couldn't cheat on her, he couldn't lie to her, and he couldn't sign treaties behind her back. But he also couldn't protect her from what was coming. Her father, the patient, cunning Ferdinand, was simply waiting for her grief and her will to finally break. And it was only a matter of time. All right, the story of what happened is over. Now we get to the good part. The part where we stop being passive listeners and become historical detectives. So put on your metaphorical trench coat, light your pipe, and let's step into the chamber. This isn't a room of stone and mortar, but a psychological one constructed over 500 years of rumor propaganda and willful misunderstanding. It's time to perform a historical autopsy on the madness of Queen Juana. C. The crime scene is the entirety of her adult life. The victim is her reputation, her freedom, and her reign. And the murder weapon. It wasn't a dagger or poison. It was something far more insidious and far more difficult to trace a narrative. A story carefully crafted and ruthlessly deployed, designed to convince the world, and perhaps even Juana herself, that she was insane. So let's begin by examining the official story, the mainstream account that has been passed down for centuries, largely written by the men who benefited from it. It goes something like this. Juana was genetically predisposed to madness. Her maternal grandmother, Isabella of Portugal, had also suffered from a deep melancholy, so it was clearly in the blood. From a young age, she was prone to fits of religious fervor and morose silence. Her marriage to the dashing Philip the Handsome triggered her latent instability, sparking a pathological jealousy that consumed her. She flew into irrational rages, unable to cope with the normal dalliances expected of a royal husband. And finally, the grief of his death was the straw that broke the camel's back, shattering her fragile mind and sending her into a state of necrophiliac obsession, making her utterly unfit to govern. It's a neat, tidy package. It explains everything. It's tragic, of course, but ultimately her removal from power was a sad necessity, a kindness even done for her own good and the good of the kingdom. It's a great story. Compelling. Dramatic. It has only one major flaw. It's mostly nonsense, a masterpiece of political spin designed to obscure a simple, brutal truth. Let's dismantle it piece by piece. Welcome to the investigation. Exhibit. The motive, or as the Romans would say, cui bono, who benefits. Before we analyze a single crazy act, let's talk about motive. In any investigation, it's the first question you ask. And in the case of Juana's alleged madness, the beneficiaries are standing right there holding smoking guns. Let's start with her husband, Philip the Handsome. As Juana's consort, his power was limited. But if Juana were declared incompetent, he could rule Castile as regent. Castile wasn't just some provincial backwater. It was the engine of the burgeoning Spanish Empire, flush with New World gold and military might. For Philip, getting control of Castile was like being the manager of a successful band and suddenly getting the keys to the entire record label. The temptation was immense. And then there's her father Ferdinand. When his wife Isabella died, he lost his status as King of Castile, retreating to his own, less wealthy kingdom of Aragon. He was a man who had tasted ultimate power and was not enjoying his forced retirement. Juana's instability was his golden ticket back to the top. If he could convince the world his daughter was unfit, he could step in as regent, reuniting Spain under his personal control. The two most important men in her life had a direct multi-billion-dollar incentive to see her fail. And this isn't speculation. We have the receipts. In 1506, Philip and Ferdinand met and signed the Treaty of Villafafila. In this document, they formally agreed that Juana was incapable of ruling due to her infirmities and sufferings, and they appointed themselves as co-rulers of her kingdom. They did this behind her back. This wasn't a diagnosis, it was a boardroom coup. They weren't concerned doctors, they were corporate raiders divvying up the assets of a CEO they had just pushed out. The motive isn't just a theory, it's documented, signed, and sealed. Exhibit B, the weaponization of a personality. Now let's look at the symptoms of her madness. The prosecution's case rests on three pillars: her jealousy, her grief, and her general passion. But when you place these traits back into their proper context, the picture changes entirely. First, her famous jealousy. The official story paints her as a hysterical shrew flying into a rage over nothing. But it wasn't nothing. Philip's philandering wasn't a discreet, behind-closed-doors affair. It was public, constant, and designed to undermine her authority and humiliate her. Remember the unsolicited haircut she gave his mistress, a one-star Yelp review from a queen who had had enough. More importantly in a monarchy, the legitimacy of the royal children is everything. A king's affairs are a threat to the stability of the entire line of succession. Juana's anger wasn't just personal, it was political. She wasn't just a scorned wife, she was a queen protecting the integrity of her dynasty from a reckless husband. Her hysteria was, in fact, a defense of her most crucial political duty. Second, her overwhelming grief and the corpse tour. This is the smoking gun for the madness theory. And yes, on the surface, dragging your husband's coffin around the countryside for 8 months is unusual. It's not a recommended way to process loss. But it was not the act of a mind that had simply snapped. It was a desperate, calculated political performance. As we've established, her father was waiting to snatch the regency. By refusing to bury Philip and by physically remaining with the body, Juana was creating a legal and symbolic stalemate. She was the grieving widow, a role that afforded her some protection, but she was also the queen inseparable from the state embodied by her dead consort. It was a macabre filibuster. She was using the only power she had, left the power of ceremony and public spectacle, to hold her enemies at bay. It was an act of profound desperation, not simple insanity. Finally, there's the very nature of her personality. Juana was a passionate woman. She was deeply religious, deeply loving, and deeply sensitive. In the 15th century, these were not considered assets for a female ruler. A man who was passionate and pious was seen as strong. A woman who was passionate and pious was seen as prone to hysteria and religious mania. Her very character, the core of who she was used against her. Her strengths were reframed as symptoms, her personality pathologized until it fit the diagnosis her enemies required. Exhibit C, the life sentence. If you have any lingering doubts, let's look at the final damning piece of evidence, the long imprisonment. After Ferdinand eventually gained control and confined her to the castle of Tordesillas, he died in 1516. This was her chance. Her son Charles came to power. Surely her own son would free her. He did not. Charles now, King Charles I of Spain, and soon to be Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V knew that his own claim to rule Castile was only valid as long as his mother was deemed incapable. If she were freed, she was the rightful queen, so he kept her locked away, and not in some comfortable gilded cage. She was held in stark isolation in a grim fortress for another 39 years. Her children were kept from her. She was denied visitors, denied any role in the world. She lived as a political ghost, a non-person whose continued existence was a quiet but essential pillar for her son's glorious reign. This was not the protective care of a loving son for his ailing mother. This was the cold, pragmatic, lifelong imprisonment of a political rival. She died in 1555, a prisoner for 46 years, a queen who had reigned only in name. So what was the real curse that afflicted Juana? What was the true nature of her cursed chamber? The curse wasn't in her bloodline. It wasn't a chemical imbalance in her brain. The curse was her gender, her power, and her passion colliding with the iron will of a patriarchal world and the bottomless ambition of the men who were supposed to protect her. Her chamber, the fortress at Tordesillas, wasn't haunted by spirits. It was haunted by a profound injustice. The madness of Juana la Loca is one of history's greatest and most tragic lies. It was a diagnosis of convenience, a political tool wielded with devastating effect. The true madness didn't belong to the woman locked inside the castle. It belonged to the system that put her there, a system that found it easier to believe a queen was insane than to accept that she was simply and inconveniently in charge. And so the door to the prison cell at Tordesillas closes behind us. After turning the pages of history written by the victors and listening to the whispers from a half-century-long imprisonment, we can deliver our final verdict. The verdict from Cursed Chambers is this: Juana of Castile was not mad. Well, perhaps she needed a long vacation and a good therapist. But who wouldn't when your family is a pack of wolves waiting to devour your inheritance? She wasn't a mad queen. She was a betrayed queen, a cornered queen who fought back with the only tools she had, her intense emotions, her stubbornness, and for one bizarre moment in history, a coffin. Her tragedy wasn't genetic, it was political. And the ripple effect from that tragedy reshaped the world. The most ironic and cruel truth is this: Juana's imprisonment was the foundation for her son's greatness. By neutralizing his mother, the rightful queen, Charles V, was able to consolidate Spain and the vast Habsburg lands, creating an empire on which the sun never set. The Spanish Golden Age, with all its splendor, art, and power, was sponsored by one woman's stolen freedom. History has rarely offered a more brutal trade, an empire built on a broken heart. In the end, the story of Juana la Loca echoes today because it is more than just a tale of a Renaissance queen. It is a chilling reminder of how the stories of women, especially powerful women, can be so easily twisted, redefined, and controlled. It shows the danger of confusing emotion with weakness and passion with madness. It proves that sometimes the most powerful tool to disarm someone is not the sword, but a diagnosis. It leaves us with one final question, one that still hangs in the air after 500 years. How thin is the line between passion and madness? The answer perhaps is that its thickness depends on whether you're the one holding the key or the one locked behind the door. Thank you for joining us in this episode of Cursed Chamber. What do you think? Was Juana a victim, a madwoman, or something far more complex? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to unlock more of history's dark secrets, subscribe. The past is waiting.